Salomé Sibonex, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so excited.
Why don't you give yourself a introduction and talk to me about who you are as an artist?
So I'm Salomé Sibonex. I'm a writer, I'm an artist, speaker. I'm also co-founder of the publication called The Black Sheep that's dedicated to individualism and leaving groupthink behind. I've been in the arts, I guess it's over 10 years, about 10 years now. I started out just as a writer, just pitching pieces to different publications. And I've also had a very interesting political journey. I was very much a woke leftist, as it would be called. And that has been a process of me developing my own personal philosophy as opposed to kind of like just adopting political ideology. And that's also been something interesting for me as a person in the arts because, as many people know, the arts lean heavily left. And so part of my work with the Black Sheep is speaking to that experience of being the outlier among your peers, being the person that isn't far left in the arts, or being the person that is the what odd one out in your family, or the person that speaks to a different perspective when no one else shares that. That really is just the symbol of the Black Sheep. And that's something that I've turned a lot of my work towards studying now, because I've noticed as I went through my own journey politically of kind of like forging my own voice, realizing that a lot of the ideas I had adopted were not helpful to me nor to others. Kind of like this critical race theory idea that people's identities are salient factors in how we should understand and judge them. Concepts like white privilege, intersectionality, microaggressions, things like these were ideas I had adopted originally and later realized these things are making me neurotic. They're making me unable to connect with other people well because I'm trying to like follow this rule book about where I am in this power hierarchy instead of treating everybody like equal individuals. And that led me to study more the ideas of collectivism versus individualism and how we have to forge our own philosophy. And that leads me back to my work with the Black Sheep. How do you do that? By being willing to stand alone.
So talk to me then, how did that, at what point did it hit you? You said you were a woke left-wing activist, and then you sort of, your political arc changed and you went on this journey and you became a writer and you started speaking out. So sort of when did you notice that artistic freedom or freedom of expression was becoming limited in the arts world?
So that was for me, I think that everything came to a head around 2020 because that's where in the United States we had a lot of the Black Lives Matter movements, and like there was rioting and protests. And I remember starting to see people who otherwise I had shared their ideas. Now they were justifying things like looting. And these were not like, oh, go loot your Walmart. It was like, yeah, loot the local grocery store. And this was, to me, a huge bout of hypocrisy where people who were advocating for compassion, equality, uplifting those who've been left behind or in hard situations, now you're telling them to go do things that would actually put them in jeopardy of getting arrested or getting attacked or getting killed even, while you're sitting at home talking about like these theories like retributive justice, when the reality is like for people on the ground, I would never give that advice to someone I cared about. I would never tell them like, it's your right to go loot. Like, it's like, that's going to get you in trouble. Like, it's just kind of, so I had this moment where I was like, reality is screaming at me. And the ideology is no longer being able to meld with that because it just became so obvious that that's not a good idea. And that started to lead me to question more things because I realized I was afraid to challenge these ideas. I was afraid to be the one that says, I don't think that's a good idea. And I think if you care about people, you shouldn't tell them to set their neighborhood on fire because, well, it's how you do systemic justice. And I became more aware of how I was self-censoring. And that started Go ahead.
Sorry, I do want to just get back into because I was in New Zealand at the time and I live in Australia at the moment. But people saw Black Lives Matter as a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they still do in the arts. So I'm just, like, people saw that as a liberation movement for,
right.
Marginalized groups. I'm interested in you to sort of, but you're in America, right? So just delving a little bit more into sort of how why you didn't see that as a good thing. If you could just get more into the specifics.
Sure, absolutely. So there's Black Lives Matter Global Network, which is like the actual organization. That's a Marxist organization. If you look into it, they've even had pages up on their website that are like, we believe in destroying the nuclear family. We believe in the redistribution of wealth and things that are textbook Marxist ideology. That's something that a lot of people who supported the slogan Black Lives Matter were completely unaware of. And so you have this happen a lot, right? Like where you have something like the concept of anti-racism, which on its face, yeah, I'm an anti-racist. Now, if we're talking about the Robin DiAngelo style of anti-racism that advocates for you to break down your white fragility and like consider your white consciousness and things that are like really these abstract terms that they invent to create racial division and perpetuate these ideas that you're inherently a different person and inherently racist as a white person, I'm not an anti-racist then. So this is the problem with a lot of these movements and these slogans is that they mean different things to different people. And so if you're talking about the kind of like on the ground, what the average person thinks of when they say Black Lives Matter, yeah, I agree. Now, if we're talking about the academics that write books like in what is the book's name? In Favor of Looting, I believe. I can't remember the author's name, but that's like, it's actually an academic argument that looting is a form of retributive justice by which those that lack power are able to take back power. But it's like, okay, what does the corner grocery store have to do with systemic injustice? Really, these convoluted arguments that are steeped in this postmodern Marxist analysis of power, that if you have a business, you have more power than the person that works at the business. Thus, the person that works at the business is justified in whatever means necessary to take power. So these are the things that are like beneath the surface of a lot of these slogans that nobody knew. And I didn't know them either. And so for me, I was seeing the difference, right? Because I was seeing the friends that I have and people that I care about who do believe in these concepts of like Black Lives Matter, and they think exactly like you described. This is a movement for liberation. This is to bring awareness to the very real issues of racism and prejudice and inequality in our society. And then there's the back door, right? Which is the people who have a different agenda and benefit from the masses thinking that this is just about not being racist, when in reality, it's about using that rhetoric as a guise for promoting an ideology like Robin DiAngelo's anti-racism, like Ibram Kendi's anti-racism, that is actually racist because of the ideas such as the only way to solve present or past discrimination is with present discrimination. So that's a Kendian idea. Right. And so this is the thing that, like, I remember speaking to my parents about this because they were like, oh, this is good. This is for equality. And I was like, are you familiar with the organization that has coined the term and what that organization believes beyond just the idea that racism bad? No idea. No familiarity with it. And that's when I started to realize this is way more complex. And when I started to notice that there's those people that care about racism and are giving that goodwill of like, anti-racism, Black Lives Matter. Yeah, of course. Good. I support it. And then there's the people that are using that goodwill and exploiting it to promote ideas that actually are the opposite of what that rhetoric implies, which is equality, treating people as individuals as opposed to treating them based on their race. And so these ideas like retributive justice and white privilege and things like this that encourage us to judge others based on their race really doesn't actually match up with what a lot of people thought that the slogans meant. And so not only did I start to realize that, I also started to realize that a lot of these activists were bullies. And I started to just notice the difference in behavior because as I started to question, like I had reached that line, I adopted these ideas. I was, engaging with the discourse and like the white privilege and the cultural appropriation accusations and all of that. And, it just, as someone that didn't know anything else, I found these ideas and I was like, okay, these are the only answers I have, and they make sense for me. It makes sense that if there's poverty and there's rich people, maybe we should take some of their money and give it to other people. It makes sense that if white people tend to have better outcomes, they must have something called privilege, and they should be aware of that, and they should do things about that, and they should not try to speak over other people who don't have that privilege. Now, of course, if you don't have anything to challenge those ideas with, you don't have any counterpoints, you don't have any context for them, then what are you going to do? They sound great and you adopt them. It was only until I started to realize these things aren't working. They're actually making people act nasty towards each other, and they're causing more racial tension. And the people that are espousing these ideas and policing how other people interact with them and the rhetoric that they use, they kind of seem like textbook bullies, telling you can't have an opinion on this topic because you're a man, or you can't have an opinion on this topic because you're half white. Things like, oh, you're white passing, so you should fall in line. And it's just forever this hierarchy of someone coming in and saying, well, you need to be checked. You need to be checked. You need to. So it's really actually the truth is in their theory is as much as they're obsessed with critiquing power, it's what they do. They're constantly trying to do this status thing of well, as a white passing person, you have more privilege than a non-white passing black person, and thus you shouldn't speak to what kind of policies we should be promoting in regards to police brutality or issues that affect black people, which is just absurd because it's so you're saying we should judge people's ideas and rights to speak based on their identity? Isn't that literally racism? And so that's what I started to realize was these people aren't really motivated by good intentions all the time. A lot of the time, it looks like they're using these ideas as a way to silence dissent and control the narrative and not actually have to engage with debate around these ideas because they just dismiss anyone based on, oh, well, you have white passing privilege or you have male privilege or you have able-bodied privilege. And it's yeah, because we're all different and we all have different advantages and disadvantages. And if we're going to use those things to judge each other by and judge our ideas by, then no one will ever be able to get an idea in because there's always going to be someone else that has some privilege you don't or has some disadvantage you don't. And so I watched it still goes on today, the kind of infighting where someone says, actually, I think it's ableist to encourage people to eat vegan food because not everybody can procure vegan food. And then someone else comes in and it's well, I think it's ableist of you to tell me what is ableist because I'm actually a disabled vegan and I have no problem doing this. And so I think you should check your privilege. It's oh my gosh, can we just talk about the ideas? Why don't we just actually say the ideas? Why do you think it's hard to be vegan? As opposed to just ranking people and saying you're not allowed to say this because of who you are. So that started to become very obvious to me. I was I don't think this is healthy, y'all.
Okay, well, there's a question in here. Well, there's a few questions in that. I suppose why the ideas why are they so prominent of this? So like everyone just seems to go along with them. You know, you describe yourself as a black sheep, but I remember being surrounded by it as well. Like it just, no one's questioning everything. Everyone's just like, yeah, like this is what it is now. This is the new ideological orthodoxy. This is what we do now. And I'm like, what? And I always thought I was the only one. Or maybe people would say things behind closed doors, but like no one would speak up. And I'm just like, these ideas are so bad on their face. Why are they so prominent? You know?
Yes. Yeah. Great question. So, I mean, that very much is why I ended up starting a publication called The Black Sheep, because I realized when you don't have a culture that allows for that kind of dissent, and when you have a culture or an ideology that demonizes and outcasts the individuals who do say, well, wait a minute, I have some questions about that. That's how you get a culture of groupthink, where people shut off their higher functioning brain and go along because it's more convenient. And so, I mean, we have research in conformity, right, that shows how easy it is to get people to go along with the group under the right circumstances. And there's one experiment that's like fascinating, where they had a group of people, and only one of them was actually a participant. Everybody else was a paid actor in the experiment. And everybody is told to say how long they think this line that they're presented with is. And so all of the paid actors in the experiment say, that line is long. Here's the picture I pick to match the line. It's a long picture. The picture of the line that they're supposed to match is obviously shorter than what everybody's answer is. The one person being experimented on in that study makes their answer go along with the rest of the group because they doubt themselves when they look around and see every other single person in the group give the wrong answer. So I can't remember what the rate of people choosing to give the wrong answer is to match the group, but it's uncomfortably high. I believe it's more than half of people will give the obviously wrong answer just because they basically don't want to be the only one that says, I think everybody's wrong. And that is exactly the scenario that I saw happen with these kind of like D'Angelo Kendian style anti-racist ideas. Nobody wanted to be the one person that stands up and says, I think these ideas are bad. I have questions. Isn't it racist to judge people by their skin color? Isn't that what we had all agreed on? Isn't this in direct contradiction to Martin Luther King's philosophy? Nobody wanted to be that one person that stands up and does that because, of course, it was also obvious that you were going to get mistreated. And that's part of the fascination that I have with the black sheep figure, because that individual who does do that usually is this kind of black sheep figure who cares more about the truth or understanding something than they care about avoiding the discomfort of being the only one that says, I don't think this is right. And those people are often the ones that lead us forward in society because they discover things. They bring things to consciousness that no one else is willing to do at the time. And so they help us move forward. But luckily, we have a culture in the United States still where you can dissent, and though you might face very unpleasant consequences. I mean, there were like cancel culture where people would have their jobs called and lose their jobs and, just terrible things where people have been driven to the edge of their sanity, feeling suicidal because they feel like they're getting piled on by strangers online, losing their job, having their family members harassed. Things like this have happened just because people didn't go along with whatever the orthodoxy was. And this is a country where you're free to do that. Nonetheless, you face those consequences. But when people do that, you have that like lighthouse effect where one person stands up and says, I don't think this is right. And that's when I realized, oh, there's always all these other people that aren't saying their doubts, but they're doubting. And they're waiting for one other person to stand up and say, I've got doubts, so that they can say, okay, me too. I got doubts too. I have doubts too. And now I feel more comfortable to say it because I'm not the only one.
Someone's articulated it. What was it like for you speaking up? Personally?
Yeah, it was really uncomfortable, but it was a fascinating experiment because it was different from what I expected. When I did my first, okay, that's it. I'm going to publicly question the orthodoxy. I'm going to see where this goes. I just can't not say anything because it seems to me so egregious that I don't see anyone saying what I think is obvious, which in this case was, do not encourage people to do crime in the name of your ideology, in the name of whatever you think justice is. Do not encourage innocent people who you do not know their lives to go into their neighborhoods and destroy other people's property, to set fires, to do violence. Don't encourage people to put themselves in those situations and then say that you care about them, because no one who actually cares about someone encourages them to put themselves in harm's way, knowing that that very well may turn out to put them in jail. And we're talking about an ideology that purports to be most concerned with uplifting Black Americans who deal with police brutality, incarceration. So why are you encouraging them to put themselves in direct harm's way of police interactions? And so that was the line to me where I was like, okay, I'm just going to say this. I'm going to post it on Twitter. And I remember calling my therapist and being like, I'm going to get canceled. I'm going to get canceled. And I just had to do it. And I remember he was like, all right, so let's get ready, because yeah, that might happen. But the opposite happened. I actually ended up connecting with like-minded people like Aisha Akambi and Africa Brooke, because they were looking for the same truth-telling. They had that same sense that these ideas are patronizing. These ideas do not seem like they're leading us in a better direction. And there were so few people at the time that were willing to say that. And I finally did it. And that's how I was able to connect with other people who were looking for other people that were willing to see that. And so it had the opposite effect to me. And that was where I started kind of like my black sheep contrarian journey, where I realized, oh, self-censorship feels comfortable and secure because it protects you from the negative backlash that you might get. But what I hadn't realized was the cost is that you don't find your people. You end up living this kind of
hollow existence.
Unaligned. Yeah, exactly. You're unaligned because you're not actually attracting and living in alignment with what you care about. You're just trying to avoid discomfort. And so you may do that, but you lack those kind of authentic relationships, that integrity. And so that really set me on a journey from there, realizing, oh, wow, your speech, authentic speech and action is the way that you live a life aligned with your values.
Now, I'm just a bit cautious about, we sort of take extreme examples and use that to paint a movement with the same brush. So are you sort of saying that, because I understand, I mean, man, it was just what I saw around Black Lives Matter, right? We just saw what we saw, whatever the algorithm was showing us or whatever media we were watching or whatever. Do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement did more harm than good?
Yeah, I do. I think it did. I think that there's been a documented increase in racial tensions. And I think that the backlash to an ideology that racializes people and tells us that we should be looking at our race first, we should be checking our privilege, we should feel bad about what our ancestors did and not and take this kind of approach of collective guilt, ultimately sets us backwards from the direction that we were progressively going in post Martin Luther King, and people that had promoted the idea of genuine equality, leaving race behind as a salient factor and viewing people as individuals primarily. And so it's not to say that we can't care about uplifting people and dealing with inequalities or negative outcomes that people are facing, but we wouldn't do that by going backwards from the progress that was made by historically incredible figures like Martin Luther King that championed exactly the opposite, was let's treat people as individuals rather than judge them by their race. And unfortunately, while I appreciate the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter, right, I appreciate the concept of police brutality is bad, I don't like the police. I don't think the police are doing a good job. I would agree with these activists on many points that there should be less policing in certain regards and police should be held more accountable than they are. But I don't think the way that that's done is by promoting like this kind of racialized rhetoric by which we say the reason police brutality happens is because of white privilege, when you have examples like Black police doing police brutality. That's not because they're white privilege, like it's something more complex than that. So in my opinion, like it's unfortunate, but it seems to have set us backwards.
I can hear in the minds of listeners probably saying things like, are you're just saying that because you're white? You don't experience racism? What would you say to that argument?
I mean, I guess if people want to characterize me as white, I'm mixed, I'm Latina, so I'm going to check your privilege. Yeah.
No, but I gotta be, I'm just offering up a counter argument. Do you know what I mean? You're what if?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do I say it in a politically correct way? You're white looking, I'm white looking. We're talking about
white
race.
Passing.
I've got to offer up that counter argument and just, I don't know what it feels like to live as a Black person,
Right. So I would argue that I reject that framing because I also reject the opposite framing, which is that you are just arguing for Black Lives Matter because you're Black. So because there are Black people that have different views than that, and I don't want to paint all people of one identity as a monolith and saying that your identity dictates how you think. Because, of course, there's many white people who love the Black Lives Matter organization and love D'Angelo's critical race theory and anti-racism and do these kind of activism projects. Is it because they're white? That's the thing about this idea that, well, you just have that argument because you're white. Well, what about the white people that don't? Like, did their whiteness just leave their body for the moment or something? So it doesn't really hold coherently. It's something that people use as a cudgel at the moment to say, okay, if you disagree with me, it's because you're white. If you agree with me, it's because you're a good ally. And I'd rather actually argue the merit of the ideas, which is what works. What is logical? What is principled?
Okay, well, let's go there then. I mean, you have kind of answered this already, but just to clarify, if ideas like white privilege and organizations like Black Lives Matter don't uplift marginalized groups, like how do you combat racism in today's day and age?
You do it the way Martin Luther King very effectively did it. You promote a classical liberal society that provides equal rights to all people, regardless of their identities, and encourages the treatment and viewing of individuals as individuals primarily, rather than as representatives of their race primarily, which is what led to so much of the terrible racism through the past, things like lynchings, like police brutality, and the violence that we saw where there was like a two-tiered system of justice, right? Because why? People were being judged based on their identity primarily, as opposed to as individuals. And when we engage in that kind of thinking, that kind of collectivist idea that you are more your identity than you are the individual you are, then we justify the logic of racism, which is incredibly scary to me. I think people have lost that kind of like understanding that everything has another side to it. So while it might sound effective and cathartic to talk about white privilege and the idea that white people should atone for the sins of the past, the reality is that that justifies the very same racist logic that says, well, then other minority groups should atone for the sins of their past. So if there's a neighborhood that is high crime and predominantly Black, and I see a Black person in another neighborhood, should I treat them like they are a representative of that other neighborhood just because they have the same skin color? No, I should treat them as an individual. The problem was in our racist past, very often you would have these kind of like lynchings and terrible violence towards Black people because they were treated as a monolith. It didn't matter that they had never done a crime and that they were an upstanding member of their neighborhood. They were treated as interchangeable with any other Black person. And so you saw that in those like terrible history of lynchings where these mobs of angry people would just pick a random Black person and murder them because they were mad about some other crime that had been done by some other Black person. In a society that is based upon individual rights, you do not harm some other innocent individual because of the crimes of some other individual. And this is the problem with this kind of like racial collectivism by which we say, you are part of this group and must act as if that's a primary factor in your life, is that then applies to everybody else. And that is the definition of racism.
I mean, yeah, I agree with that. I've also you've made me think of Jonathan Haidt. You know, he says identity politics. Yeah, identity politics can be used two ways. You know, one way we see today is it's to lambast or attack someone. You know, you're white, therefore you're a this, or you're a man, or you're, you know. But it's also used to say, hey, these people in my, you know, group identity are marginalized, and we do need to be uplifted because it's our group identity that's causing us to be oppressed or marginalized. I suppose it kind of seems like it depends how oppressed, you know, it's the same with women, gays, you know, like how oppressed are we in reality, and then how oppressed do people just believe they are, which is kind of hard to quantify these days with like media coverage and
absolutely.
You just brought all that to mind. I'm like, because you talk about racism in the past, and then it's like, well, obviously racism still happens today, but you're right, we have come a long way. And, you know, I think the George Floyd incident for a lot of people just represented, I mean, I guess how racist society still is in a way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's better than it's ever been in some regards. So, I mean, you have much more culpability in the fact that you had this outpouring of outrage in response to that event is the proof of our progress, right? Because if you look in history, events like that happened and there was not such an outpouring of sympathy and rage and accountability. I mean, it was like a collective panic. You had institutional level responses to that murder, and that's great. That shows that people care. But the problem is when we forget how we've made our progress, how we've gotten to this point, and we get so impatient and so perfectionistic and utopianistic in what we want that we say, this isn't good enough. Martin Luther King didn't do enough. We need to start like actually atoning with reverse racism, which is the Kendian idea that, like he's quoted as saying, past discrimination is solved by present discrimination, which I resoundingly reject because that in itself implies that, well, won't you at some future point need to change that strategy once you've reached enough present discrimination that it's now just discrimination? So it just ends up being this like cycle. And that's the real problem with collectivism and identity politics, is that it's often just, okay, this group has oppressed that group, so now it's their turn to oppress back. Well, then eventually it's going to be the other group's turn to oppress you back, as opposed to lowering the temperature by removing identity as a salient factor by which we judge people. I mean, it's a really pernicious thing because you can already see that there is backlash towards the Black Lives Matter rhetoric and movement by which people became numb to accusations of racism because they were used so flippantly. It was like, if you simply disagree with my ideas of white privilege and microaggressions and reparations, you're a racist. And it's like, no, that's not what racism is. And when you use it in that flippant way to tarnish people, as opposed to actually use it because it has happened, you dilute the power and the meaning of that accusation, and people become numb to it. And then when there really is a problem of racism, how you express it? Because you called everything that wasn't racism, racism. So what do you do when actual racism happens? And it's the same thing with feminism and for women's rights. If we push further and further this rhetoric that's like, and anti-man and like very harsh and critical and positing women as like always in this eternal position of victimhood. Well, how do we differentiate when there's really problems that women face versus when it's not that way and it's just rhetoric that we're using to get our way? And I've seen already the backlash to that. Like there is an increase in people being unconcerned with racism, unconcerned with genuine misogyny, because it has become this like buzzword that if you disagree with a woman, if you criticize her, you're a sexist. It's like, that's not what it is. And it just dilutes the power of those accusations that are still problems. And we shouldn't be that flippant with them.
Yes. Yeah. The words really lose their meaning, huh? Oh, man.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you've talked a lot about sort of group identity and individualism. I'm wondering, just to sort of recap on that as well, why is individualism more important than group identity, in your opinion?
It's freedom. It gives you the freedom to live the life that you want, whereas group identity puts you in a box that says this is how your group is, and so this is how you should be. And oftentimes that group identity, while it can be nice to engage with on your terms, if it comes to you in the form of like collectivist ideology where now you are a problem if you disagree with that, that's a box. And that's so ironic to me when I see it in terms of like identity politics, whether it's feminist rhetoric or critical race theory rhetoric, intersectionality, these things that tell you, well, this is how we think as women. This is how we think as Black people, as Hispanic people. Because then when you disagree and you say, I actually don't think this feminist idea resonates with me or is helpful, well, oh, you just have internalized misogyny. Oh, you're just a pick me. And there's all these slurs that are used for Black people that don't go along with whatever the ideological orthodoxy for being Black is. And I'm not going to repeat them because I think they're terrible. And it's a punishment for stepping out of line. But what's the line? That this is just how we think, and so you should think that way because you share our skin color, because you share some phenotype with us. So that's why I posit individualism as a form of freedom, because you can still engage in your culture, in your group's customs and whatever the group identity aspects that are meaningful to you, but not in a way that tells you how you must be and how you must live, because that ultimately is a restriction that can keep you engaged in things that aren't that good for you. A good, healthy group will be fine with its dissidents. It will be fine with its black sheep, with its outliers, because the ultimate goal isn't to control the group. It's simply to be a community. So we can be a healthy community where we share things in common, but also respect each other when we want to differ. And so that's the idea of, to me, community versus collectivism, is that it respects individualism, which is at the end of the day, my fundamental duty isn't to uphold some group identity or orthodoxy. It's to live in my integrity and to live by my values. And I would love if my group shared that, but if they don't, I'm not going to subjugate myself to the needs of that group.
Whew. All right, and you're quite the, as you've just conveyed, you were quite the proponent of freedom of speech. Tell me why that's so important to you.
Can't make art without it. Can't make art without it. So I'll start there. It's not just that though. I mean, freedom of speech sounds a little stuffy. And what I like to think of is freedom of expression, which is basically the same as freedom of speech, but it characterizes it in a much more personal way. And freedom of expression is ultimately the freedom to discover yourself, to explore your world. It's an amazing thing, like the ability to articulate things out loud in conversation, just to kind of like try words out, allows your brain to process in a more full way and lets you think things through. It's why conversation is so powerful and engaging for human beings. It's what we're meant to do. We're meant to converse with each other, to engage with each other. But we need the freedom to do that without the fear that, well, if I'm debating and I make a point that people don't agree with, I'm going to be exiled from everyone. And like, even if I didn't really mean it, even if I'm just playing devil's advocate. And so the freedom to experiment, to explore is intrinsic to self-discovery, to self-growth. And if you're in this kind of environment where you don't feel like you can say what you think and you feel like you are at risk of serious backlash if you simply question things that you're curious about, how do you grow? How do you discover things? How do you figure out what you actually care about if you can't do like the scenario that I described earlier when I finally spoke my piece and said, I don't think we should encourage people to loot their own communities. How do you know what's on the other side of an action if you can't take that action? And speech is very much an action. So it's a crucial thing to self-discovery and, of course, to making art.
Oh, man. Sorry, big sigh after every long answer you give me. No, this is great. I just... we are sort of living in a time where people have different political opinions and political beliefs, and, we disagree over things. You seem to be interested in emphasizing, our common humanity. I suppose that's probably one of the answers to this question, but I'm sort of like, how do we foster relationships with those we fundamentally disagree with?
Yeah, okay, wonderful question. That is so hard to do. So I'd like to just put it out there that that's incredibly hard to do, and I struggle with it to this day within my own family. So I don't want there to be any doubt that this is an incredibly challenging thing to do. But the reason you do it is because it makes you better and it makes the other person better. When we get out of our insular echo chamber where we just think that things are exactly the way that we think they are and we don't challenge our thoughts, we grow. We grow when we do the opposite of that. If we stay in that state, we stagnate. And so I think it's like helpful to recognize that the benefits are twofold, both for you in terms of developing as a person that has a better understanding of the world. Because, you see this so often where it's like, oh, those people I disagree with, they're just stupid. Those people I disagree with, they're just evil. They're not. They have reasons, just like you have reasons. And the funny thing is that they stand in their group and point at you and say, they're just stupid. They're just evil. And wouldn't you love if they actually listened to what you had to say? So do it to them. It's just the golden rule. And so I come at this from like multiple angles, which is it's good for you. It's good for other people. It's a model too, right? So it's like you need the motivation to do this. It's not just that like, oh, I'm being nice to people I disagree with. It's not about being nice to them. It's about modeling the way that you think it's good for us to be. And so when other people see people doing that, engaging in civil disagreement, being willing to humanize the people they disagree with, it makes it that much easier for them to replicate that behavior themselves. And like the ideal world would be that more people do this so that the outlier becomes dehumanizing your opponents, not engaging in civil disagreement with the people that you are opposed to. And so that becomes like, oh, that's like an unevolved, unenlightened way of being. Also, the thing is like, I think we're afraid. I think we're afraid to have our ideas challenged. I think we're afraid to be wrong. I think we're afraid of the complexity that like, maybe I don't have it all figured out. And so the easiest way to avoid dealing with those fears is to not challenge ourselves and to just believe, yeah, we have it all figured out. I don't need to talk to anybody ever again and have any disagreements with anybody. Like, I've got it. It's all good. And like, I get it. It's super uncomfortable. And if you're like me, you probably really dislike conflict also. And it can get heated and like, you don't want to deal with that. And so it's a practice of growth. It's for you to do that. Of course, it has all these other benefits, but like, coming from curiosity, where it's like, okay, I'm not trying to change my beliefs. I'm not trying to change their beliefs. I just want to know what they think. Like, get into therapist mode. This is actually, if you can get there, it's a super fun way to be, because it lets you be open to things instead of kind of like needing to stay guarded and needing to stay closed off because you don't want to get challenged. You don't want to have to deal with like the discomfort and the complication of amending your views when someone presents a good point that now suddenly your worldview didn't account for. Don't worry about that part. Just come in questioning neutral mode, which is, okay, why do you think that? Well, what would you say if someone disagreed because they viewed it in this way? Okay, that's interesting. Why do you prefer to do it this way instead of this way? Okay, what would be a middle ground? Like, if you had to compromise on this policy or this belief, what would be the compromise you pick? So like, go into interviewer mode, go into therapist mode, where it's not about defending your point. It's about understanding and studying, like just straight up learning from another person's point. And I swear, like if you do it right, people open up in the most fascinating way. I've been in situations where I'm like at a party and I am the odd one out. And I'm like, okay, no one actually really cares to understand what I'm thinking. So I'm going to go into like interviewer mode, therapist mode, and just understand what they're thinking. And it is incredible, like how much people want to be heard. They want to be listened to. And you can do that if you're willing to listen to people who disagree with you instead of feeling so urgent the need to defend your point of view. Just put your point of view away. Like just, it'll be there when you come back, and just listen. Like, let someone else talk and let someone else say what they're thinking. Because you know what's super amazing about that? You might get them to change their view just by giving them the space to actually finally completely talk out what they're saying, have it be questioned, not in a like, oh, but this is that and da. Just asking questions way, because that allows them to think things through on a deeper level in a place that's like more secure than what it feels like when someone's interrogating you and saying like, no, but I think you're wrong because of this. And like, oh, but you do not care about these people, or like, that makes people defensive. And then that makes them just want to like dig their heels in even more. So, I mean, trying, if you can do it, I mean, you can change the fucking world if you can develop this skill. I am not kidding. Like, it is one of the most powerful things I've ever seen, I've ever done. It is very hard to do. I'm not, and you know, like I see people make this argument. This was another thing that I saw a lot of like the kind of like woke leftist activists around me when I was like in that space. They would demonize people that would try to talk to the opposing side. They would demonize the act of talking to your opponents. And you would hear this like, don't platform such and such. I don't engage with so and so. And it's like, that's a weakness. Okay, that's not a moral strength. That's not a display of of righteousness. That's a weakness. And we've become so twisted as a culture where people stand up and say, I don't talk to people that I disagree with, and present it as if it's some kind of a strength, when ultimately the strength is being able to do the opposite. The strength is being able to have a civil conversation with people that have different perspectives than you. And if you really want to be an effective activist, it's the best way to get people to change, is to let them just talk it through and ask some questions, help them think it through, instead of sending them into this like defensive state where they're only more motivated to guard their point of view.
Man, that sort of answers a lot of my next two questions. They were sort of how to work collaboratively with people that have different political opinions, and then how would you encourage other people to sort of challenge ideological orthodoxy. It seems like what I hear you say is really just to humble yourself and listen.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It helps a lot. It helps a lot. I mean, you know, it's so interesting. I more and more I realize that the way, it's not about what we do, it's kind of about how we do it. And I've found that it's so like woo, but the energy you bring to something is so transformative. And I just wish more people had that practice of paying attention to their state of being, because like that was another thing that I didn't realize at the time, but I later became aware of, was I was completely ignoring the fact that when I was engaging in this kind of like leftist activism online, I was not in a good place. I was insecure. I was afraid. I was angry. I was constantly trying to like do the one-up thing of like, oh, well, actually, I'm Latina, and so you can't tell me this. And like, well, as a woman, this thing of like trying to pull rank instead of being like, here's what I actually think. Like, let's have a conversation of the ideas, because there's vulnerability in that. It's much more secure to just say, this is my hard, fast rule that I am this identity, or you are that identity, or you are that belief, and I don't talk to people like that, and I don't have this conversation. These kind of things that like, they're just walls. They're walls. And if I had a little more self-awareness at the time, I would have realized you're afraid. You're afraid. And that's what you're doing. You're hiding behind this ideology. You're hiding behind these concepts. And now I'm a little more secure. I'm a little more mature. And I'm able to just go to that place of like, let's have the actual conversation. And I can listen. I can be open. It doesn't threaten me as much to hear someone with a different perspective. And that is a power. So if you're trying to engage with people who have different views and you're trying to collaborate with them even in some kind of work way, there's many things that go into that, right? Because it's not about being a pushover either. It's not about like, oh, I'm just never going to say my views. That ain't right either, because you don't want to be in this place where you're self-censoring and you're just kind of like, just never going to really put myself out there because it's easier. Because that's easier too, is just to never have your opinion. And it's a strength to say, I hear where you're coming from. Yeah, I can see how that would make sense. For me, I view it in this way. This is how my thinking works. And so I've came to this conclusion. That's that balance between I can make space for you to have your view. I can be open enough to accept that you are you. You have these beliefs. You live that life. And that doesn't threaten me because I have the space to live my life and to have my beliefs. And that kind of energy really is transformative to the relationship, because you will see people who for who they are, because there will be people who don't want to hear that, right? They don't want to hear your beliefs, and they will exit. They will remove themselves from your life because you have made it clear that I'm not going to be a people pleaser. I'm not just going to bite my tongue and let you say all the things that you want to say and dictate the conversation and have your beliefs when I don't get the same treatment. And so it's a very powerful way. And that comes back to like, what is the benefit of free speech? Speech is like a creative force. It creates you. It creates situations. It creates relationships. And so you can use it to be like, this is who I am. This is what I believe in. But also by giving people the same opportunity to do the same thing. And that creates like, that is equality. Like that literally is equality in action.
Totally. All right. Just to sort of wrap up this interview, I just sort of want to ask, we've talked about this radical left-wing ideas like, white privilege and microaggressions, and this cancel culture and censorship and deplatforming. Do you think all these things are sort of on the decline now? Like the pendulum really went to one end of the 2020, and it's just like I'm sort of starting to rethink a lot of this stuff, and I'm like, there was such a huge pushback. We had people like you, but many people were like, nah, this is not all good, and it's been 4 years now. Like, do you think things are starting to recenter themselves a little bit?
So I hope. It's a complicated situation because the crazy thing is, so my fiance, Jake Klein, he recently published a book on the history of the Robin DiAngelo style anti-racism. And what's fascinating about that book is that you realize this isn't new. This was around in like the 70s. These ideas were developed in, I believe it's like the mid 60s to 70s. And then they kind of disappeared for a little bit. And then they came back. And so that's the problem, is that we are always at risk of bad ideas resurging and coming back in different ways. And it's a fascinating thing because, I mean, like, we're in 2024 and we're still having serious debates on free speech. Like, should we criminalize hate speech? Should we criminalize misinformation? And you would think this was settled with like the Constitution of this country, like forever ago, like years, hundreds of years ago. But we're still having these conversations because not everybody knows everything that has ever happened in American history. And so the same problems come up because they're human problems, right? Like, it's very human to look around and be like, but sometimes speech is bad. But sometimes speech does bad things. What if we got rid of the bad speech, guys? It's like, yeah, that's a great question. That is a valid observation. But we've actually already played out that experiment. That's the thing about knowing history and studying these concepts, the philosophy, the origins, the applications. You can look through history and find out what happens if you criminalize forms of speech. And it's not good. And so that's why only a few hundred years ago, the founders of this country were like, let's not run that experiment again. I think we've got it. We are fleeing, actually, the persecution of our freedom. So we're going to try to protect that here so it doesn't play out again. But that's the thing, is like, these are human problems living in society together. So these things will keep happening forever. And sadly, maybe they'll be different, though. They'll be different. It won't be Kendi. It won't be D'Angelo. It won't be anti-racism. It won't be microaggressions. It'll be something else. It'll be different. But it'll require the same skills. And that's what's so exciting about, like, learning from these experiences and understanding that, like, okay, no matter what it is, if you come at things from a principled perspective, which is, what are my core values? What are the core things that I always abide by in my life? That can solve every question that gets thrown at you. You don't have to have a predetermined answer for every question. You just have to have principles that you can apply, because if your principle is, I tell the truth, then whenever something comes up where there's a situation where it's like, oh, you shouldn't say this because people are offended by that now, or you're not supposed to question this because of your identity or whatever it is, you have a principle that you always tell the truth. So now you already have the answer to this new scenario. And so that was something that I learned through my experience, figuring out like how to navigate these ideas. Once I realized this shit is not helping me. This shit is not helping a lot of people. Like, what actually will help me? What actually will help people? And it's principles. It's knowing your fundamental values and then acting on them in the world and analyzing ideas through them. So while I do think, yeah, these ideas are on decline in certain respects, in other ways, they're still quite entrenched. It's culture changes quickly, but also very slowly. So I think it'll take some time before we reach like a critical mass where most people agree, yeah, I don't think that present discrimination is the solution to past discrimination. By the time we get there, I guarantee you there's going to be some other problems coming from some other backlash to the present situations. Like, so many of the movements that we have is just like backlash to backlash to backlash. And my hope is that the more we become principled thinkers, people that live based on integrity as opposed to getting like swept up in the moment and influenced by our social groups, influenced by culture, the more that we act from integrity instead of that, the more we can start to slow that process of backlash to backlash to backlash, because we start actually not being in perpetual reaction.
And finally, how did you become so, learn to become so articulate and know yourself and your own core beliefs and be able to speak on them? Because you seem to really know what you think, what you believe, and you can articulate it well. How did that happen for you?
Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. So it happened with that very first step where I decided to say what I actually thought, despite thinking I was going to get piled on for it, and taking an action from this more gut feeling of, it doesn't seem like anybody agrees with me, but I'm going to feel good about this action. And that was the beginning of me developing this sense of, you could call it intuition, where I was more driven by what I truly cared about and truly felt was good for me and resonated with my values and beliefs than with what I thought would be easy or other people would like and thus not yell at me for. And that is not going to be the same for everybody, because not everybody has that kind of issue with like self-censorship and people pleasing. But nonetheless, taking actions that are aligned with your values and your integrity is how you become the person that you are meant to be.
I'm mainly thinking also about putting it into action, like,
yeah,
because to articulate how you think is such a skill. Like, what was it like? Like writing, you make videos, like just for anyone who wants to be able to articulate themselves more, like, what was it? You know what I mean? Like you're articulating how you think so well. I'm just like, writing? All I can think of is writing. I don't know. I'm not trying to flatter you. Like, I'm genuinely curious.
That's so nice.
So other people, yeah. Oh, I mean, for me as well.
Oh, okay, for sure. So writing.
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
Writing is really helpful. Writing and reading. So I actually, before I was even kind of like aware of what the hell was going on in the world, I was just kind of in my own little world, like teenage, whatever. I read a lot. I read old books. I loved reading Nietzsche. I loved reading psychology textbooks, and I loved reading poetry, novels, and a lot of that helped me in a really interesting way, because I think it was particularly that I was reading older things that helped me to develop a certain way of articulating my ideas in what I think is a more evergreen style, because I've always tried to connect whatever I'm talking about that's like topical, like of the moment, with a broader reality, with like life itself, as opposed to being like, oh, this headline is bad because of this fact. What's the eternal truth of that thing? And that immediately takes you out of like this politician and this person said this and this word, and it takes you into a more broad, abstract, and often more poetic way of speaking, because it's no longer tied down to these like little details. And so I learned how to talk about things in a way that was more, I would say, like principled and lasting. That's what I really liked about the readers or the writers that I read, is that they were dead. They've been dead for like forever. And I was still reading this. I was like, this is so on point still. And I was like, that's how I want to write. And I would watch speakers. So that is a good thing you can do. I highly recommend, if you want to get better at speaking, look up old speakers that you like, whether it's, I loved Camille Paglia. I look up her speeches. Christopher Hitchens is a great speaker. I can't think of anybody else right now, of course, off the top of my head. But like, if you find those kind of people and you just watch, like a lot of them have videos of them giving speeches, and it's fun to watch. And you also realize like the way that they're speaking. And of course, practice. I had a podcast for like over a year, and it was a podcast where we go like for it's like an hour and a half just talking about philosophy stuff and things like that. And the more you talk about the ideas that you want to talk about, the better you get at talking about them. I swear, it's just that. And like, it's even the same way for me now. if it has been a little while since I've done like a podcast like this, I'm dusty. I feel real rusty right now.
If this is you, Dusty, then what the heck are you like not dusty? I don't know.
I feel rusty. I mean, it's also probably in your head always. Like, I know every time I'm like, oh, you could have done better. I'm like, no, if you feel like that, you probably did fine, actually.
Yeah,
like, you would know if you really flubbed.
Was critic. Okay, well, I'll let you go. What's next for you, I guess? What's next for you? Where can people find you?
Yeah, go to wetheblacksheep.com. That's where I'm doing all my work. I write about the philosophy of individualism. I write about the psychology of groupthink, of conformity. That's my big pet project right now. I also publish poetry there. I receive poetry submissions, kind of around the same theme of the black sheep. Yeah. And it's a great thing. Like, we also publish people's stories of challenging groupthink. So all these different stories of people that were in a situation where they felt like, I don't see anyone doing what feels like the right thing. I'm going to do it anyway. And then that turning out to be this transformative journey for them, stepping out of like a collective that wasn't right for them and forging their own paths. We have like lots of stories from people that have done that. And I think that the more we go through time, social media is like a really intense technology that I believe has a collectivist streak in it, because we're all kind of like in this village now and we're all seeing each other. And so it's never been easier to succumb to social pressure and conformity and like self-doubt. And so the ability to think for yourself and stay in your integrity and know what you really care about and stand by those things when it feels like you're the only one that's going to stand by them, that is a superpower, and it's only becoming more valuable. So you can find all of that at wetheblacksheep.com.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been really great to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's so fun. Thank you for having me.
All right.